All right, welcome back. So in the previous video, we talked about how fear and morals and values are primary drivers for HIV-related stigma. But now let's talk about what are the forms of stigma. So you were probably wondering, well, Sahil, what does that stigma look like in communities? So now that we know that what the sources of stigma are, what is that stigma? What does it look like? And so this is a very general overview. Like I said earlier, it really depends on the community that we're talking about, but the overarching theme is still the same amongst communities, so there's that consistency. So there's four types of stigma that exist towards individuals who are HIV positive, and the first is physical stigma. And by physical stigma, we're talking about isolation, and we're talking about violence. Isolation is more common than violence, but I still wanted to address both. So, in terms of isolation, we're talking physically isolating the person who is HIV positive, whether it be at home, putting the person in a separate portion of the house, separate sleeping areas, separate utensils, separate blankets, not sharing any of those things with the person who is HIV positive, and you can see that's a result of an educational aspect that we talked about in the previous video, but it kind of transcends from the home as well. Community members avoid sitting next to the person who is HIV positive, or really anywhere. People avoid kind of being physically around the person who is HIV positive. And then, of course, when we talk about violence, we're talking about physical violence. We're talking about beating the person who is HIV positive, throwing stones, really, physically abusing the people who are people who are HIV positive. In terms of social stigma, we're talking about isolation again. So when we talk about isolation, we're talking about less interactions, verbal, like talking interactions with family members or community members, or not allowing the person to attend social functions within the communities. And then when I talk about visits, or voyeurism is the term that is really used when we talk about this, there's increased visits from neighbors who don't come because they want to check up on the person who's HIV positive, but they come over because they want to see the person and mock the person. And so in terms of that last one, there's a sense of a loss of identity of that person, because community members believe that maybe that person is no longer a productive member of society due to their infection, or that the individual has no future. In terms of verbal stigma, kind of interplays with social, but it's kind of verbally saying things to the person or about the person to stigmatize them. So in terms of verbal stigma, we're talking about things you can imagine, like gossip, speculating how did this person get their HIV virus, spreading rumors about the person. And then there's taunting the person, insulting the person, and finger pointing. In terms of blame, we can kind of talk about family members who blame the person who is HIV positive for putting this whole sense of bad luck on the family as a whole. In terms of labeling, people who are HIV positive are often treated, they're kind of labeled in a derogatory sense, with people in Africa using terms like, this is translated to English, but a moving skeleton or a walking corpse, and in places like Vietnam, scum of society. And then the final form is institutional stigma. And, there's a lot of different types of institutional stigma, but the whole idea is a lack of inclusion in institutions. That really kind of sums it up. But if we wanted to break it up, we're talking about livelihood. So a person who is HIV positive, if the employer finds out, person who is HIV positive often loses their job. Loss of housing, denial of housing, being treated differently in schools, maybe being separated from individuals who aren't infected as a sort of protective mechanism for the kids who aren't infected. So once again, that kind of plays into that kind of lack of a comprehensive education about transmission. And then we can talk about healthcare, which is very important. I think this is one of the most important types of stigma, because healthcare professionals may use unnecessary precautions, exaggerated precautions, but they might also deny health care to the individual as a whole. And we know that that's a big issue, because if a person who is infected with HIV is not receiving their medications regularly, then he or she may develop AIDS, and that has another whole host of issues, and can ultimately it's a fatal condition. And then if we talk about media, there's media messages that kind of go out that kind of provide this perception that HIV is this negative thing, and there's these fear tactics that go out, and as I talked about earlier, kind of plays into those fear messages that develop a sense of fear in a community towards individuals who are HIV. So now that we kind of talked about the different forms of stigma, you might be wondering, well, what is the effect of this stigma upon a community? We talk about really 3 different effects. It goes from the individual to the family, to the community. So it goes from kind of microcosm to macrocosm. First effect is individual. So we're talking about a loss of livelihood that I kind of talked about earlier, losing a job, losing the ability to contribute to society because people kind of stigmatize that individual. Difficulties in marriage and childbearing. If someone, particularly a woman, is identified as HIV positive, her spouse might abandon her. If somebody isn't married and they're identified as HIV positive, then they have a very difficult time getting married, and they may not ever be able to have children as a result of that. And then there's also this sense of internalized stigma, where an individual kind of stigmatizes himself or herself because there's this sense of a loss of any hope, feelings of worthlessness, or believing that truly he or she has no future. And so the second type of effect of stigma is a family effect. So in terms of caregiving, oftentimes family members kind of pull back on the care for that individual, whether it's because of that fear of transmission, or it's because of that anger, that sense of blame towards that individual who is HIV positive. But there's also a secondary sense of stigma. So we call it secondary stigma. So community members also stigmatize the family because they believe that family members can also contribute to the fact that the person got infected with HIV. And then the final effect, which this really impacts a community as a whole. So when we're talking about that whole treatment aspect, because people who may or may not be HIV positive are afraid to get tested for HIV infection, they may unknowingly pass HIV to the people that they're having unprotected sex with, and potentially to their children, because they're afraid to get tested. They're afraid of being stigmatized if they are found to be HIV positive. And people who are HIV positive are afraid to disclose their HIV status, and that really kind of plays a role in terms of sexual partners, because there have been many reports of people who are HIV positive who don't disclose their HIV status to their partners, and they don't use condoms during sex because the use of condoms may imply to a partner that he or she is HIV positive. So we have, because of this lack of disclosure and this lack of testing as well, we're having the potential for HIV to spread rapidly within communities through the different routes of transmission. It's also very difficult as a result of these things to kind of prevent HIV from spreading, because people aren't disclosing their HIV status and people aren't getting tested for HIV. So it's very difficult to prevent HIV in that sense from spreading within a community. And so there's kind of this cycle where more and more people are getting infected, and that it kind of reinforces this stigma that exists within a community. And so, once again, people are going to kind of talking about testing. People are afraid to get tested for HIV as well. So I hope that this 2-part series was pretty informative about the critical role that stigma plays in the lives of individuals who are HIV positive, particularly in developing nations, and how it can affect their families and communities. It's something that's not really talked too much in the classroom setting, and I hope that this kind of sheds some light on the problem of treating people who are HIV positive within some of these communities.